Before the sun came up, one light was already on. Not the whole house, just the kitchen. One woman, standing in front of a shelf that held far less than anyone outside those walls would ever have guessed. A little flour, a few potatoes counting down their last good days, a heel of bread going stiff at the edges, maybe an egg or two she had already promised, in her head, to someone who needed it more than she did. And she looked at all of it the way a captain looks at a map before a long crossing. This was the hour nobody remembers, because nobody was ever meant to see it. The children were still asleep. The rest of the house was still asleep. The whole long day that would keep reminding this family they were poor had not started yet. And for a few quiet minutes, before the fear had to be folded up and hidden again, she stood alone with the honest math of the home, how much was left, how far it had to stretch, and how many people were counting on her to make the shortage vanish before breakfast. She was not only a mother that morning, she was a system. She was the bank, the pantry, the tailor, the nurse, the planner, and the last line of defense, all standing in one tired body in a cold kitchen. And the strangest part, the part that still stops people cold when they finally understand it, is that she made it look like nothing. Like it cost her nothing. Like there was always going to be enough. There often wasn't. But you would never have known it from the table. We tend to picture the Great Depression as breadlines, dust, and men in worn hats staring at locked factory gates. All of that was real. But the fight for survival was not only fought out in the streets, it was fought at home, quietly, mostly by women, in kitchens exactly like this one, before anyone else was awake. And it was won or lost in small decisions no history book ever bothered to write down. How to turn one pot into 2 meals. How to make a coat last through a second child. Where to hide the few coins that stood between the family and disaster. When to say, "Not this week," without breaking a child's heart. Now, here is the part that matters for you. Most people watching this did not live through the 1930s, but a great many of you were raised by someone who did. A mother, a father, a grandmother who never quite trusted a full cupboard, someone who saved string and buttons and rubber bands and every jar that came into the house, someone who could not throw a good thing away to save her life. For years, maybe, you thought that was just how she was, a little too careful, a little old-fashioned. It wasn't. It was history, living inside a kitchen drawer. It was a hard decade she survived, still whispering its instructions to her, quietly, 40 and 50 years later. Because here is the truth this channel keeps coming back to. Those homes were poor, but they were not helpless. Today, when something runs out, a modern house can come to a full stop. The card gets declined, the delivery runs late, the power blinks off, and suddenly a family with a refrigerator full of food has no idea what to do next. Back then, running short was not the emergency. Running short was Tuesday, and the house kept standing anyway, because someone at the center of it knew exactly what to do with less. So over the next half hour, we are going to walk through what those Depression-era mothers actually knew. Not vague nostalgia, not things were simpler back then. Real, specific knowledge. The way she read a pantry, stretched a meal, managed money nobody could see, raised children inside a crisis without ever letting them feel it, and held an entire home together with skills the modern world quietly handed away. Some of it will sound like a memory. Some of it will sting a little. And by the end, you may find yourself thinking about one particular kitchen, one particular woman, and everything she carried that you were never supposed to notice. She was poor, and proud, and frightened, and steady, all at the same time. So let's start where she started, before the sun, at the shelf. Let's stay in that kitchen a little longer, because everything she did began here, at the shelf, in the cold, before the day started asking questions. 1. She counted in days, not meals. The first thing she knew, the thing modern homes forgot completely, was how to look at food and see time. A younger person opens a cupboard and asks, What do I want to eat? She opened hers and asked something older and harder. How long does this have to last? A sack of flour was not dinner. It was a number of days. Half a bag of potatoes was not a side dish. It was a countdown. She could stand there in the dark and do arithmetic that no school ever taught her. How many mouths, how many mornings, how much had to be left when the money finally came. And here is the part that cost her something. She carried that number in her head all day, every day, and she never said it out loud. The children ate without knowing they were eating inside a budget. That silence was the work. Anyone can be worried. It takes a certain kind of strength to be worried and still set a calm table. 2. She knew how to stretch one pot into 2 meals. A single pot of anything was never just tonight's supper. It was raw material. She cooked knowing that what was left would become the next day's lunch, thinned with water, extended with an onion, carried forward with a little more of whatever the house still had. Nothing was made to be finished in one sitting. It was made to travel, from supper to the pot on the back of the stove to a bowl the next afternoon. Today we call it meal prep and sell it as a lifestyle. She called it Tuesday, and she did it not because it was clever, but because there was no other choice, and because a family that ate twice from one effort was a family that stayed ahead of the shelf for one more day. 3. A leftover was not a problem, it was a plan. Somewhere along the way, the modern kitchen decided that leftovers were sad, something you eat when you've given up. In her house, it was the opposite. The bit of meat left on the bone, the last spoonful in the pot, the crust nobody finished. None of it was failure. All of it was tomorrow, already handled. She looked at scraps the way a careful person looks at small change. Not much on its own, but foolish to throw away when you know exactly what it adds up to. That was not poverty food. That was intelligence under pressure, and it required her to think 2 and 3 days ahead while everyone around her only had to think about the plate in front of them. 4. She built the whole week around bread. Bread was the anchor. When money was uncertain and the future was a rumor, a loaf on the counter was one thing you could count on to fill a stomach and quiet a worry. She knew how to make it go far. The fresh slices for the meal that mattered, the day-old for toast. The stiff heel that most people would throw out, softened into something warm and turned back into food. Bread that was too far gone was not garbage. It went into the next dish, or it fed something in the yard that fed the family later. There was a kind of respect in it. She had watched what hunger did to a house, or she had heard it from her own mother, and she was not going to let a single slice go to waste while she still had breath to prevent it. 5. She served in the order of who needed it most, and she ate last. This is where the list stops being about food. She served the working body first, the father who had to carry something heavy the next day, the child who was still growing, the grandparent who had gotten thin. She filled their plates with the calm authority of someone running a house, and only then did she look at what was left for herself. Sometimes it was enough, sometimes it wasn't, and on the days it wasn't, she said the words that thousands of women said in kitchens exactly like hers. I already ate. I'm not hungry tonight. You go ahead. It was a small lie, told with love, over and over, for years. And the children who believed it did not understand until they were grown, standing in their own kitchens, doing the math themselves, that their mother had fed them from her own plate and called it a full stomach. That is the quiet center of this whole story. She was not just managing food. She was absorbing the shortage into her own body so the rest of the house would never have to feel it. But feeding the family was only one department. The house itself had to keep working, and that was a second full-time job she also did without applause. 6. She repaired before she replaced. In her world, a thing that broke was not automatically gone. A loose chair leg got 2 screws and another 10 years. A torn seam got a needle before it got a decision. A sole coming away from a shoe got mended and greased and pushed through one more winter. Replacement was the last resort, not the first reflex, because replacement cost money the envelope in the drawer could not spare. And this took real skill. Not a subscription, not a repairman, not a video to follow. Her own hands, her own patience, knowledge she had absorbed from watching someone older do it before her. The modern home lost this one habit at a time, until we became the first generation to pay more and no less, throwing away things our grandparents would have quietly fixed at the kitchen table. 7. She gave everything a second life. Nothing arrived in that house with only one purpose. A worn sheet became patches, then cleaning rags, then something to stuff a draft under the door. A coat that a child outgrew was not sold or discarded. It was folded away and it waited, sometimes for years, for the next child to grow into it. A jar that came in holding one thing stayed to hold another. Paper was smoothed and saved, string was wound and kept. To an outsider it might have looked like clutter. It was not. It was a house that understood that replacement was never guaranteed, so anything still useful was worth keeping close. Every reused thing was one less thing she had to worry about buying, one less line on the list she'd have to cross off at the store. 8. She kept it clean when there was almost nothing to keep. Here is something people misunderstand about hard times. The poorer the house, the harder she often worked to keep it clean. Because cleanliness was the one luxury that cost no money, only labor, and she had labor. A swept floor, a scrubbed table, a made bed, a clean apron. These were not vanity. They were dignity. They were the way a family told itself, and told the world through the front window, that being short of money was not the same as being beaten. A scrubbed table with little on it still looked like a family table. That was the whole point. She used cleanliness like armor, a way to stand up straight when the bank account was on its knees. What the children remembered later was not the emptiness of the room. It was the warmth of a room that someone had cared for on purpose. 9. She got the house ready for the cold before the cold arrived. Winter did not surprise her. She met it at the door. Long before the first hard freeze, she was thinking about it. Drafts stopped with rolled cloth, blankets pulled out, aired, checked, and layered by which bed held the smallest body. The warmest corner of the house quietly designated as the one that mattered. Heat cost money, whether it came from coal, wood, or a meter on the wall, and so heat was rationed the way food was rationed, with a plan, and with the youngest and the oldest protected first. She did this while the days were still warm, and no one else was thinking about it. That was the pattern of her whole life. She was always one season ahead of the fear, doing the worrying early, so the family could stay warm late. 10. The laundry line was a strategy, not just a chore. The last thing in this first half is the humblest, and it hid more thinking than anyone gave it credit for. Wash day was heavy work. Water hauled, heated, scrubbed by hand, wrung out, hung, watched. But it was also planning. She washed by the weather, reading the sky to know which day the clothes would dry. She turned collars and cuffs to double the life of a shirt. She mended in the same motion, catching the small tear before it became the big one. Clothes were not disposable. They were an investment she protected every single week. And when a child went to school the next morning in clothes that were worn but clean, patched but pressed, that child carried something the modern world can't buy at any price. Not new clothes, something better. The invisible proof that someone at home had stayed up and bent over a needle and refused to let poverty show on the outside. That was her whole method, in one image. Poor, maybe, but never ever helpless. Feeding the family and keeping the house running took skill. But there was a third job, and it was the one that kept her awake, because before any of it could happen, the money had to be managed, and there was never quite enough of it to relax. 11. She hid the money that stood between the family and disaster. Somewhere in that house, there was a hiding place. A can on a high shelf, a jar behind the flour, a folded envelope taped under a drawer, a coffee tin that had stopped holding coffee a long time ago. Inside was almost nothing. a few coins, a bill or two, smoothed flat and folded small. But that little bit was not spending money. It was the wall between the family and the emergency that always, eventually, came knocking. The doctor, the broken thing that could not wait, the week the work simply did not appear. She added to it when she could, a coin at a time, taken from a grocery trip she had squeezed harder than anyone knew, and she guarded it with a discipline that would stun a modern household. Because she understood something we've had the luxury of forgetting, that when there is no one coming to help, the only safety net a family has is the one it hides on the top shelf. That tin was not greed. It was fear, turned into a plan. 12. She kept the whole budget in her head, and it never turned off. There was no app. There was no alert on a phone telling her she'd spent too much. There was only her and a running total that lived behind her eyes from the moment she woke up until the moment she finally, uneasily, fell asleep. She knew what was owed and when. She knew what was left and how long it had to last. She knew, to the coin, how much a shortfall in one place would cost in another. She carried the family's entire financial life as a set of numbers she never wrote down and never got to put away. And that is a kind of labor the modern world doesn't even have a word for. We talk about mental load now like we invented the idea. She lived it, silently, for decades, without the language to name it, or a single soul to share it with. The exhaustion of always knowing. The exhaustion of being the only one who knew. 13. She bought by the calendar, not by the craving. Payday was not a day. It was a rhythm the whole house moved to. She knew exactly where in that cycle the family stood at any moment. Right after the money came, there was a little breathing room, the day you bought the thing that had to be bought. As the days stretched on toward the next paycheck, the house pulled in tighter, the meals got simpler, the answer to almost everything became later. She shopped against that calendar with a precision no one taught her, spacing out every purchase so the family never hit empty before the money came back. Compare that to how a modern house often runs. Buy what you want, when you want it, and sort out the damage when the statement arrives. She did the opposite. She did the worrying first, in advance, so the shortage never caught the family by surprise. The bills were her motivation. She did not need any other kind. 14. She knew how to say "not this week" without breaking a heart. This is one of the hardest things a person can do, and she did it constantly. A child would ask for something small usually, something that cost almost nothing to the world, but everything to a budget stretched to its last inch. And she would have to say no. Not a cruel no, not an angry no, but that steady, practiced "not this week" that thousands of mothers said in thousands of stores, standing in front of a shelf they could not afford. Here is what it cost her. She wanted to say yes. Of course she did. No mother wants scarcity to be the thing her child remembers. So she learned to say no in a way that didn't feel like poverty, that felt like patience, like later, like a promise instead of a wall. She absorbed the disappointment so the child only felt the delay, and the child, most of the time, never even knew there had been a wound there at all. 15. She was part of an economy no bank could see. No family survived entirely alone, and she knew it. There was a quieter economy running underneath the money, an economy of favors, traded back and forth between houses that all had too little, a cup of something borrowed and returned, a skill offered in exchange for a hand, someone's father who could fix a thing, someone's mother who could sew a thing, all of it moving between kitchens without a single dollar changing hands. She knew how to give without making it charity, and how to take without losing her dignity. That was a real skill, and it was a delicate one. Ask too much, and you became a burden. Give too freely when you had nothing, and you shorted your own children. She walked that line for years, and it built something the modern world pays fortunes trying to recreate, and mostly fails. Real neighbors, real ties, a web of people who would actually show up. We traded that for privacy and convenience. She would have told you it was a bad trade. But here is the part that turns this whole story from admirable into unforgettable. Every single thing she carried, the numbers, the fear, the hiding tin, the constant no, she carried in a house full of children who were never supposed to feel any of it. And that was, maybe, the greatest skill of all. 16. She taught them how to wait. The children in that house learned something early that many modern children never learn at all, that wanting a thing and getting a thing were two separate events, sometimes separated by a very long time. She taught it gently, but she taught it constantly. Not everything came now, some things came later, some things came never, and you learned to be at peace with that too. Waiting was not punishment in that house. It was simply how the world worked, and she folded it into her children so quietly they mistook it for their own patience. And what a gift that turned out to be, because a person who knows how to wait is a person the world cannot rattle so easily. The modern world sells the opposite. Everything now, everything instant, every delay treated like a defect. She raised children who could sit with a want and not fall apart. That patience followed them for the rest of their lives, long after they understood where it came from. 17. She gave each child a real place in the system. The children were not just mouths to feed, they were part of how the house ran, and they knew it. There was a task that was theirs. Something to carry, something to watch, something to keep clean or bring in or hand down. It was not busy work, and it was not cruelty. It was belonging. A child who fed the animals or minded a younger one or brought the wash in off the line was a child who mattered to the survival of the whole and who felt it. That is something a lot of modern homes lost without meaning to. When a child is given nothing to do that actually matters, the child learns, quietly, that they don't actually matter to the running of things. She gave her children the opposite lesson. You are needed here. This family works partly because of you. There is a kind of confidence that only grows in soil like that, and she planted it without ever calling it parenting. 18. She kept the table set so the fear would stay invisible. This is the center of everything. This is the thing that should stop you cold. She knew exactly how bad it was. She carried the real numbers, the real fear, the real nights of not knowing. And her whole art, her entire, exhausting art, was making sure the children never carried it too. The table got set. The meal, however thin, got served like a meal. The worry got folded up and hidden behind a calm face before anyone else came into the room. Children are far more perceptive than we give them credit for. They can smell fear in a house. So she didn't just hide the fear, she replaced it with routine, with steadiness, with the sheer reliable ordinariness of a mother who acted like tomorrow was handled. That was not dishonesty. That was love doing the hardest work love ever does, carrying the weight alone so the small ones could stay small a little longer. 19. She taught with her hands, not with lectures. She rarely sat a child down to explain the value of $1. She didn't have to. She just let them watch. They watched her turn one pot into 2 meals. They watched her mend instead of throw away. They watched her count and save and stretch and make do, day after day, until the doing became a language the children learned without a single lesson. That is how the real things get passed down, not in speeches, but in the 1,000 small motions a child sees a parent make and quietly absorbs. And this is why those habits outlived the decade by 50 years. A woman who learned at her mother's elbow to save the string and smooth the foil and guard the last coin did not stop when times got better. She kept doing it, in the 1950s, in the 1960s, in a kitchen with a full refrigerator, because her hands had been taught a truth her comfort could never quite erase. If you were raised by someone like that, you were raised inside the echo of a decade you never lived. 20. She protected their childhood by making the scarcity invisible. And so, in the end, she pulled off something close to a magic trick. The children in that house often did not know they were poor. Not really. They knew there were things they couldn't have, but they didn't know about the tin on the shelf, or the nights she ate last, or the numbers running behind her eyes at 3 in the morning. They grew up feeling, mostly, safe. Fed, held, and that feeling was not an accident. It was manufactured, daily, at enormous cost, by a woman who decided that her children's peace was worth more than her own. You hear it in the way people say it, decades later, with a catch in their voice. I never knew we were poor. They say it like a small miracle, and they're right. It was one. Somebody stood between those children and the full weight of the crisis and held it off with nothing but her own 2 hands and her own tired back, and never once let them see how heavy it was. That is the woman this whole channel keeps circling back to. Not a symbol, a person, frightened and steady and utterly unwilling to let her fear become her children's inheritance. Poor, yes, but never, for one single day, helpless. So we come to the last part of this, and it's the part that stops being about them and starts being about us. Because for everything those mothers knew, the hardest truth is what happened to that knowledge. It didn't get passed down forever. Somewhere along the way, the modern world looked at all of it, the counting, the mending, the saving, the waiting, and decided it wasn't needed anymore. 21. She knew how to make a thing last, and we forgot that a thing could. She lived in a world where everything was meant to last, because everything had to. A pot was a lifetime pot. A coat was a years-long coat. A good knife was passed to a daughter. Nothing was designed to be thrown away, because throwing away was a luxury no one could afford. We live on the other side of that now. Things are built to be replaced, and we've been trained to replace them without a second thought. And somewhere in that trade, we lost the quiet satisfaction she knew every single day. The feeling of making something last, of winning a small war against wearing out. She would look at how much we discard, and she wouldn't be angry. She'd be bewildered. All that good, still useful life, thrown out. To her, that wasn't wealth. It was waste wearing the costume of wealth. 22. She ran the home as a system, and we turned it into a place where things are delivered. This is the big one. This is what the modern house really lost. Her home was a system, every room, every drawer, every routine connected to survival. The kitchen fed the family, and the leftovers fed tomorrow. The yard fed the kitchen. The laundry protected the clothes. The saved coins protected against disaster. Nothing stood alone. It was a machine she ran with her own 2 hands, and when one part strained, another part covered for it. The modern home is not a system, it's a destination, a place where food arrives, where repairs are outsourced, where nearly every need is answered by someone outside the walls. And that works beautifully, right up until the moment it doesn't. When the delivery fails, when the money's late, when the power blinks off, a modern family can find itself standing in a full house with no idea what to do. Her house had a plan for the bad day built into every ordinary day. That's the difference between a home that consumes and a home that survives. 23. She found dignity in doing, and we were sold the dignity of buying. Here's something that got quietly reversed. In her world, dignity came from what you could do. The woman who could feed 6 on almost nothing, who could turn a worn coat into a warm one, who could hold a home together with skill and will, she was respected for it. Doing was pride. Somewhere along the line, that flipped. We were slowly taught that dignity comes from what you can buy, the newer thing, the faster service, the convenience that proves you've arrived. And in accepting that, we handed away the older pride, the deeper one. The satisfaction of a thing done with your own hands. She had almost no money, and more of that pride than most of us will ever feel. That should tell us something about which kind was real. 24. She had patience, and the modern world treats patience like a defect. She knew how to wait, for payday, for the season, for the thing that would come later, or maybe never. Waiting was woven through her entire life, and she wove it into her children too. We were handed the opposite. Everything now. Everything instant. Every weight reframed as a problem to be solved, a friction to be removed, a flaw in the system, and in gaining all that speed, we may have lost something she had in abundance, the steadiness of a person who can sit with a want and not come apart. Patience wasn't just a virtue in her house, it was a kind of strength, a shock absorber against a hard world. We traded it for convenience, and we're only now starting to feel the cost of that trade in our own restlessness. 25. She did the most important work in the house, and no one saw it until it was gone. And this is the last thing, the thing this whole half hour has been walking toward. Everything she did was invisible. That was the point. The counting nobody heard, the fear nobody saw, the meals she skipped and covered with a small kind lie, the coins hidden on the shelf, the nights bent over a needle so a child could walk into school with dignity. She built the entire safety of that home out of labor that was designed to go unnoticed. And it did go unnoticed, for years, sometimes for a lifetime. Most people only understood it later. Long after, standing in their own kitchens, doing their own math, they finally felt the weight she'd carried and realized she'd carried it alone, and smiling so they'd never have to. That's why grown men and women still get quiet when they talk about their mothers and grandmothers from those years. They're not just remembering a person, they're remembering everything they didn't see at the time and wishing they could go back and say thank you for it. So picture that kitchen one more time, the same one we started in. It's later now, the day is done. Everyone has been fed and worried over and sent to bed. The house is finally quiet, and she's standing where she stood before the sun came up, in the same small kitchen, at the end of a day that took more out of her than anyone will ever know. She looks around at the empty room. She lets herself feel it, just for a second. The tiredness, the fear she carried all day and never set down, the weight of being the one who couldn't fall apart. Just for a second. And then she takes a breath. She reaches for the cloth on the edge of the sink. And she begins again, getting the kitchen ready for a tomorrow that will ask her for everything, all over again. That was the job. Not glamorous, not seen, never finished, just done, every single day, by someone who decided that her family's safety was worth more than her own rest. They were poor. So many of them were so poor. But they were never helpless, and the home they held together with their bare hands was not a place of shame. It was a quiet act of love, repeated so many times it became invisible. Until now, until the people who were kept safe inside it grew old enough to finally understand what it cost. Maybe we gained a great deal, more comfort, more ease, more things than she could have dreamed of. But somewhere in all that gaining, we may have set down the very thing she never once put down, the knowing, the care, the skill of making a home survive. We got the comfort. I sometimes wonder if we lost the caring. If any of this brought back a face, a kitchen, a memory of someone who held your home together, take a moment and honor it. Subscribe to the Depression-era Home. Like this video so more people find these stories. And tell us in the comments, what did your mother, your father, your grandmother do to keep the home running when times were hard? What habit did they carry for the rest of their lives? Share this with someone in your family who remembers, or who should. Your memory, written down in one comment, might be the reason a stranger finally understands their own grandmother. They were poor, but they were not helpless. And neither, it turns out, are we, as long as we remember what they knew.